Good evening, everyone. Anyone who is here for FYE credit can see this lovely lady in the lilac shirt at the front of the room who will scan your event pass. Otherwise, I know many of you are not here for freshman experience, first-year experience credit, but thank you to those gentlemen who have joined us for that. My name is Michelle DeMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to really our very first program of the fall 2024 semester. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to remind everyone of some of the wonderful things that we have coming up just in the next couple of weeks. Of course, the model of the object that Jeff Price is going to be speaking about is up in the Bellarmine Hall galleries on view, a model of the Antikythera mechanism that we're going to hear about. I was very sad to learn that I cannot actually calculate eclipses through the actual device that we've got, but what can you do? We don't have the original that is still in Athens. Coming up, our next opening event is going to be Friday, September 20th. It's going to be down in the Walsh Gallery. The exhibition is Sacred Space, Contemporary Printmaking. We hope you'll join us at 5:30 for the opening conversation with the curator, and at 6:30 for music and food in the lobby. And on Thursday, September 26th, we'll be opening the show that's actually open tonight. We did a soft opening of the show up in Bellarmine. If you like European art, if you like Prince, if you like Rembrandt, if you like Dürer, visit the Bellarmine Hall galleries to see the Ink and Time show, which was co-curated with Fairfield University students. It is actually open until 8 p.m. tonight. So after you leave here, if you would like to stop up there, it is open and waiting for you. The opening night celebration for that show will take place on Thursday, September 26th. You can always find out about all of our wonderful programs, which are all free, on our Eventbrite page, which is fuam.eventbrite.com. Carrie, did I miss any of them? She was meant to prompt me. Fantastic. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jeff Price, who is going to be sharing with us this evening some of the role that his father, the eminent physicist, Dr. Derek Solla Price, played in uncovering the role and functions of this famous Antikythera mechanism. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jeff Price.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm very pleased to be here. It is my first time speaking about my father's work on the Antikythera mechanism and his role in deciphering it. First, we're going to see a film from the Heraclidon, a very short film showing the workings of the mechanism, if we get that going. I certainly wish my father could have seen that animation. Unfortunately, he died when computers were just getting good in 1983, and he had the model in front of him. What I want to begin with is talking about how he came from a home in East London, which was a working-class neighborhood, to do world-class archaeological scientific discoveries. And it all began here with a little boy and a very large rabbit. You may not expect that's where it all begins, and in fact, you'd be right. There was no rabbit involved. However, there was a large sponge, and we'll get to that in a moment. My dad loved curious inventions, scientific comics and magazines, and this led him to leave home at the age of 14 to go and work in scientific laboratories. And he was inspired by the types of inventions that he had seen, like this large cyclotron or atom smasher, which could dissolve your enemies, but of course do no harm whatsoever to your friends. And this was important as he got into his teenage years, because the right-wing fascists were coming to control in Germany, and throughout Europe and England, where he was, there was a great fear that this menace could destroy society. And he wanted to be involved in saving the world. So at an early age, he went to work in the Cavendish lab at Cambridge, which was where Crick and Watson were unraveling the double helix of DNA, and he liked working in the lab with the people who were actually making the instruments. He believed that the anonymous folks in the labs who were making various glass tubes and apparatus and little machines to prove what the scientists hypothesized, that these guys in the lab deserved equal credit to the physicists and scientists who worked in their offices, but they needed the folks in the lab. The first discovery he made was a manuscript in the college library, where stuffed into the binding, he found the signature of Geoffrey Chaucer. And he presented this to the Royal Society in the year that I was born. And the manuscript by Chaucer, written in 1392, showed how to make what he called an equatory of the planets, basically a type of astrolabe, a brass circular mechanism that could show you the positions of the planets against the stars and phases of the moon and things like that. And that made headlines all over the world, even getting into Time magazine, and set him on a path to do more scientific research. In fact, he was inventing a field that came to be known as the history of science. And he was there at the beginning, while at Cambridge he worked with a couple of his colleagues to produce a nice, thick academic book on the astronomical clocks of China. And it turned out that China had very complex geared mechanisms and powered mechanisms that were powered by water that were centuries ahead of what the clockmakers and scientists had made in Europe at the same time. And then, fortunately enough, he hit on the Antikythera mechanism, which had been dug out of the ocean floor in a shipwreck that was discovered about 1900. And he hypothesized that it was from the island of Rhodes, which I'm sure looked a lot better in 100 BC than it does today. And he felt that the mechanism came from the school of Archimedes in Greece and was on a ship bound for Rome when it got caught in a shipwreck. And my father got to, as he said, fiddle about with the bits of the mechanism. And here we see him with a big caliper measuring the gears and looking at it through a magnifying glass in a way that would never be allowed today. You'll notice he doesn't have any gloves on. He's not using any protection that a 2,000-year-old artifact might deserve. And some say that today his fingerprints are still on the Antikythera from this handheld research that he did in the early 1950s. And luckily, again, X-rays came along that could look into this chunk of seabed artifact and could show what was inside. And for the first time, in 1952, 53, you could look inside the mechanism and see little gear teeth in there, and not just a few of them, but lots of them. So I remember him laying a big drawing out on our dining room table and taking a little felt tip pen and drawing out the notches of all the little gears. And once he had made a drawing like this, it didn't take long to complete the circles and make a model of how many teeth were on all the gears. This one had 32 teeth, and obviously it was connected to other gears. So he made the first drawings of what he believed to be in the mechanism. And as he was researching that, X-ray technology turned into gamma ray X-rays, and he was able to see more and more gears inside the corroded fragment. And obviously, these didn't exist on a flat plane, on a plate like an astrolabe did. It would need to be in layers for those gears to all interact with one another. So he made a model that showed a front door, a front dial, some mechanism, a back dial, and a back door, and he managed to get all of that right. So here he made a model of how the gears intersected. And let's take a look at that for a minute. In the center of the drawing, you see an inner shaft that connects various layers, and right to the right of where it says inner, you'll see a 38-tooth gear that turns a 48-tooth gear. And it doesn't take much higher mathematics to understand that if you turn that 48-tooth gear one revolution, the little 24-tooth gear next to it will turn twice. Well, that's simple enough, but let's look at that 24-tooth gear that now has a shaft that leads to a gear with 127 teeth. And what happens when you connect that to a 32-tooth gear that has more shafts connecting to a 64-tooth and a 32 and a 48 through a differential turntable? And most of us would get quite lost there, but my father's background in clockmaking and his persistence in trying all the different ways that those teeth could interlock led to more details of the model, this one being a modern one, where you can see the various dials connect and connect to counters that can show you the calendar, the position of the moon, the phases of the moon. At the bottom, an eclipse predictor, a calendar, and other dials that could show you the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games that led to the Olympics. And now, for the first time anywhere, you will hear my father talk about the mechanism for a few minutes. And this hasn't been heard by anyone since 1976, when he gave a lecture series at Yale, where he was professor of a newly founded history of science department, and it was called Neolithic to Now. showing basically the whole history of science in 25 lectures. And what you'll hear is the beginning of lecture 24, where he talks about the mechanism, and I have illustrated his talk for him since he didn't have the advantage of gathering these images that we have today. So I present to you Derek de Solla Price, 1976. Let's see.
First of all these are the fragments that exist of the Antikythera mechanism, this Greek machine from the 1st century BC that sits now in the National Museum in Athens and came from the world's first bit of underwater archaeology when some sponge fishers in 1900 accidentally went down after the day after going to shelter out in the storm. They went down to see if there were any good sponges and saw a sunken treasure ship and brought up the arm of a statue, and later the Greek government went back with them, and of the half dozen fishers, a couple died of the bends. They were skin diving with no scuba tanks, about 2.5 minutes to go down, a minute on the bottom, 2.5 minutes coming up, that is holding their breath for 6 minutes, to a depth of about 400 feet, which you just can't do. Anyhow, they brought up some magnificent bronze statues that are now very famous, beautiful things in the National Museum. Some marble ones that aren't beautiful at all. They may have been, but they've got leprosy. And then lots of bits and pieces. And amongst the bits were these sort of round stone things that might have been hands or legs or a head. And one of the stone balls, after lying out on the museum steps for half a year or so, cracked open, revealing these pieces inside. You can't see it there, I'll show you later, but there are gear wheels all over that thing. And it's from the 1st century BC, and there's perfectly good Greek inscription on it, and we now know exactly what it is. It's one of these models illustrating the interlocking gears of the cycles of the calendar. If any of you have looked at Mayan or Aztec astronomy, you'll know how they are fascinated by the permanent cycles of the calendar, working rather like our days of the week, going round and round and round, and never do we go Sunday, Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday. We always get it right. And interlocking in that is the cycle of months and the cycle of the year. And this is a model showing the way the gods set up the interlocking cycles of the sun and the moon, and perhaps the planets, but they're missing. And on the bottom right are the little dials, slip rings, that could turn around, one for each of the cycles. There on the bottom left is a nicely divided scale. The big thing with 4 spokes on the top is the main drive wheel of the whole thing. And if you look at it closely, there is a patch on the wheel at 10 o'clock, the spoke at 10 o'clock. You can see a square patch on it where the spoke was broken and a patch got soldered over it. So we know that it worked and was repaired and then went on working. Well, that is how it looks, and that is what is in just the big fragment. When you look at it very closely and draw it out, you can see the drive wheel and all the other little gear wheels connecting to it. And then on the other side of the plate, the remarkable thing is this sort of big double gear, which carries another couple of little gears on it. That is a differential gear, the same thing we have in the back axle of a motor car. Now, all this to show, what's the purpose of it? We don't know anything about this from the literature. Our evidence of the Greek world is very fragmentary. We mustn't pretend we know it all. Just the things that survive are very peculiar. Just big buildings and big statues. Most of the little things are lost. Most of the fragile things like this are lost. We must never make the mistake of saying they weren't there because we don't know about them. Now we have one of these and we know that there were many of them.
It's good to hear him again. When I visited him in his office, he loved showing off what he called his little toys and turning all the gears, making things work that people had never expected in the history of science. And he delighted in these models. Here he is turning a little crank on the side of it. And when I was young, he started to make the first model of the Antikythera mechanism, which you see here. And he made it out of a cigar box and a couple of pieces of cardboard and an old luggage strap, which when I took off, revealed the bits inside as far as they were known from the x-rays of the time. And those x-rays allowed him to draw out some of the gears, and you had enough information here to fill in the other months and fill in some of the inscriptions because they just made sense. So they came very far with it. On the right is 256 cycles of the moon and other inscriptions that included an instruction book to tell you how the machine worked. And as he drew out more and more gears, like you see here, marking them with a felt tip pen, he got very precise calculations of how the different gear wheels interlocked. And he wrote those up in a book of the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, which nobody read, but he later published them in a book called Gears from the Greeks, which did get scientists interested. But the thing that got them the most interested was when it was on the cover of Scientific American in 1959 with the title Ancient Greek Computer. And think back, if you can, to how rare the mention of a computer in 1959 would have been. This was revolutionary research that wrote the history of science in an entirely different way, going back 2,000 years with inventions that they later thought only came in the Renaissance. So they did more and more research on the little dials and gears and were able to actually make the mechanism out of sheets of brass using the antique methods of simply cutting it with a file and making the little teeth work. And if you needed an extra tooth, you could take a quadrant of it and squish in one more tooth to make the correct number of gears. And it worked. Not particularly smoothly. The gears were not as advanced as they later became, but the darn thing worked, and here are its various parts, looking very much like a model set that you could buy today. But we have to remember that this was made about the time that Vesuvius was erupting in 100 BC, and every one of the pieces had to be made by hand, hammering out sheets of brass and then cutting the teeth and putting it together correctly. And there were some funny gears in there. This one has a pin and a slot mechanism, so that, when it turns, can draw out the exact movement of the moon, which is not a circle around the Earth, and it isn't even an oval around the Earth, it's an ellipse around the Earth, and you can only draw that by some pretty fancy mechanics, like a pin and slot mechanism, which baffled them for decades. And they made a first replica of the model that showed its doors front and back. There's a little tiny model of it there on the desk. And they got the basic idea right, and with every turn of the research, the models got better and better, and the details got better. And we know that on the front and the back doors were an instruction book so that whoever received this could actually operate the machine and know what all the gears were doing. Now, some of the models varied a little bit. This one has kind of a knobby thing on the left, and it turns up in some very peculiar places. This is a cave painting from Ceylon, going the other way around the globe from it getting to Rome. And Arthur C. Clarke, who helped write 2001: A Space Odyssey and about 500 other books, hypothesized that this was a mechanism, perhaps like the Antikythera machine, but it does seem that she's listening to it, and the idea of it being a transistor radio was quite impossible, as was Indiana Jones' adventure with the Antikythera mechanism, which he called the Dial of Destiny. And of course, the Antikythera had nothing whatsoever with traveling through time, but mentioning Archimedes did put it in the right place, although you couldn't have shown up with him. But they got parts of it right. And why they chose the Antikythera mechanism to illustrate an Indiana Jones movie can only be speculated at. But it continued to be researched. And here in 2022, he was on the cover of Scientific American once again. And for a guy coming out of a working class home in East London, being on the cover of Scientific American twice was really a great honor. And he always wanted to be the most famous man in his field. In fact, I remember my mother calling him the great man, which was, I guess, how he liked to be addressed at times. And that certainly jives with my memories of him. And we know that the mechanism got more and more detailed in models. The one on the left is very much like that model I showed you that led to Indiana Jones. And on the right is a more detailed construction of the machine with all its gears and dials in the right place to make a mechanism like this. Although the original would not have had see-through sides, it certainly helps us realize how it was made. And on the right-hand illustration, you can see a little knob in the middle that would turn all the gears as you rotated that dial. And on the front and the back of the machine were pointers and scales which showed you the phases of the moon, the positions of the planets. They did find all the planets in the machine eventually, and all the phases of the moon and the Olympic Games and all sorts of things that could not have been figured out by any hand calculations. And in fact, this became a valuable machine, not just among scientists. But let's imagine for a while that you were a learned guy back in 100 BC, and you got a hold of a machine like this and went down to the local tavern and told somebody next to you, I bet you, I can tell you that there will be an eclipse of the sun 8 months from now on a Tuesday in the afternoon, and the sun will go black. Do you want to bet? And by doing that, you could make a lot of money, which is one thing that makes science move forward when the government supports it, because it's very useful. It's much harder to get funding for things that are useless to the outside observer, like theoretical physics. Only when you can do something useful do you start to get paid for it. And they've recently found this, which I can only show in a fuzzy picture because that's what I've seen, but that's from a recent archaeological dig near the site of the Antikythera mechanism, and it doesn't take too much of an imagination to believe that this hooks up somehow with the Antikythera mechanism. And we don't quite know how yet. So after 75 years or so of learning and 2,000 years since the thing was built, we still don't know exactly all of how it works, which is a remarkable thing considering most artifacts from 100 BC are fairly easy to figure out. Well, this one wasn't, and we haven't found other things like it, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist. You don't make one of these without it coming from somewhere and the mechanics being used again. But things in metals got melted down and small things got lost, and so far we've only found the one of it. But many books have been written about it, both hypothesizing things that might have been like it and some of the myths surrounding it. Now, my dad died in 1983, and this is one of the last pictures of him, a drawing by a college buddy of his who made one drawing of his 40 years before this one. But this is exactly how I remember him. He wanted to be known for his discoveries and his writings. His first book, on the right, was translating a medieval manuscript on palmistry. And he absolutely didn't believe in palmistry or horoscopes or anything like that, but he liked figuring out how they worked. In the middle is a book that he wrote on the science of science, and he used as a cover illustration a very well-known print by the Dutch artist M.C. Escher, and he brought home books about him, and that became my lifelong interest, and in fact a way for me to make a living in my art gallery in Norwalk. And on the table there's a little card with a link to my talk about that. His best book on the history of science probably was Science Since Babylon, which gives the whole history of scientific research from the beginning to the end as he knew it. And again, he illustrated it with a pattern that looks a lot like an M.C. Escher drawing. I find it a pity that he didn't put the Antikythera mechanism in the middle of it, but he didn't think of that. And books continue to be published today. This one was published in Greece in both Greek and in English a couple of years ago, and it tells the story of the Antikythera in graphic novel form over the course of about 60 pages. The one on the right shows a particularly nice page about my dad, and I know where they got the pictures from. Down at the center left, you'll see him measuring the mechanism with calipers, as you saw earlier, and the Scientific American cover. And I encourage you to look into this book. There's a link on the table where you can get it from Etsy without the shipping charges that I paid to get a couple of copies of it for my kids, because in this 21st century, often graphic novels get the story more interesting, shall we say, to the types of audiences that might show up here at Fairfield University. This is the last photograph of my dad, and he is cradling in his hands the model of the Antikythera mechanism. And the look on his face and the tenderness with which he's holding it feel to me like he has found the keys to the universe, and he is thrilled to hold that majesty in the palm of his hand. Arthur C. Clarke wrote to him and said that I've often stated that the Antikythera device represents one of the greatest what-ifs in history. Had the technology that produced it continued, by now we would be beyond Centaurus instead of wondering when we'll go back to the moon. And we still wonder that 50 years later, but the technology sort of stopped at 100 BC and wasn't revived to move forward until the Renaissance. And that gap of 1,500 years got bridged by my father's work and his colleagues who looked into the Antikythera mechanism and indeed found the keys to the universe. And that leaves me time to answer any questions you might have. There are some books on the table that he either wrote or described the Antikythera mechanism, and a model in green of how it was under the sea when they pulled it out in 1900, and a model of one of the first reconstructions. I appreciate you all paying attention, and I particularly appreciate Fairfield University for allowing me to speak in the voice very much like my father some 30 years after he couldn't tell the story anymore. So thank you all very much. So I hope you can come up with at least one good question. Okay.
Purposely eyeballing the ancient professor, but you know.
Well, first off, thank you so much for telling such an important story to be told. But I'm particularly interested in this idea that he is inventing a discipline, and he's clearly producing all these fantastic models. And I just wonder if you can speak a little bit to what you remember in terms of, you know, the team he was assembling. Are these his students? Are these his colleagues? Is he going out and finding, you know, machinists and clocksmith to help him with these gears? What's the team he's composing for this?
Well, when he was at Cambridge, working in the lab where Crick and Watson were doing their research on DNA, he really hit on the field of the history of science. He had got a PhD in physics, and his thesis was investigating, here we go, the infrared emissivity of non-ferrous metals, which I'm sure interests everybody. But at the time, it was critical for things like bomb research, which as the 1930s rolled along, became more and more important. However, my dad was a devout pacifist as well as an atheist, and he didn't want to be involved with making the mechanisms of war. So he never told us, his family, what he was doing with the infrared emissivity of metals. He said it came as a great surprise that they were using it for war research. However, I can't believe that if you're in a lab at Cambridge working on heating metals at the time when they were making war machinery, that he would not have been involved in that. But there were secrets acts that were taken very seriously, and I think he not only didn't want to admit it, but he wanted to abide by that edict that had been given to him. However, he couldn't get a proper job at Cambridge. There was some anti-Semitism of him coming from a Jewish family, and at Cambridge it was very much a traditional English hierarchy. And he didn't come from a family like the McAllisters from Yorkshire and things like that. And he didn't speak like them. And his advisor, who was a Nobel Prize winner, actually wrote a little note that I recovered that said, oh, Price is smart enough, but he doesn't have much social sense. And in fact, my mother described it as he wasn't socially housebroken. And that's true enough. He was very much an iconoclast and got sent off to have a post in about as far away as you could get in the British Empire, to the University of Malaya in Singapore, which had just been freed from occupation. And there they were rebuilding the library. And he took home with him the transactions of the Royal Society, which went from Newton up to the present. And he stacked them all against the bedroom wall and started to read them cover to cover. And he was a very fast reader and very interested in the history of science. And reading the royal transactions led both to a fascination with how history of science developed, and also when he looked at the curve of the books stacked up against the wall, he noticed that they went from rather thin piles to very thick piles as the years went along. And that led to a theory of the exponential growth of science. Basically, an exponential growth means that the faster it goes, the bigger it gets. The bigger it gets, the faster it goes. And that pretty much revolutionized the field of the scientometrics and led to a whole field of how do we know if something is good science or not. And it turns out that the best way to measure that is to look at the number of footnotes in a scientific journal and see how those reference other researches in other journals. And the more important the journal is, the more points it gets. So if your paper is cited 25 times and 15 of them are in very prestigious journals, you get a very high score. And this was noticed by a couple of guys at Stanford, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who went on to use algorithms very much like that. And oh, how my father would have loved taking credit for the founding of Google. But in fact, that is how it came to be. And he was simply ahead of his time, and he liked a good story, and he liked amplifying it a little bit more than other people. And the fact is, he got it right so often that he founded a half dozen fields that didn't exist before. So that was a long answer to your question, but it's a good story to tell.
Great, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Yeah, it amazes me. I mean, you're looking back 2,000 years. We have all kinds of phenomenal machinery these days that can get down to, fractions of a millimeter. But back then, they didn't have any of that. Or you believe they didn't have any of that. So the idea that they could take a mechanism like that, how many gears were interacting? 30 to 40 or more?
About 40,
right?
As
Yeah.
they figure today.
And to think that somebody or some mass of men could accurately file those teeth on the large gear and all the other gears that had to interact, that is absolutely phenomenal. So is it possible that they could have had some machinery back then that we don't know about?
They had basic mathematics and basic technology. And I've learned this from studying M.C. Escher patterns and figuring out how was it that the Arabic culture could make those fancy mosaics that they put around fountains and on walls that look terribly complicated. And it turns out that you need basically 3 sticks. One of them should be very straight, and it doesn't need to be a ruler. It doesn't need to have any markings on it. The other 2 sticks you tie together at the top, and you can use as a caliper or a compass. And by making circles around straight lines, you can make all those designs that make the fancy mosaics in the Alhambra. And simply dividing a segment in half and in half again, you can come to a 138 tooth gear. And then you have to match up what you can see in the heavens. Obviously, you can see the rotation of the moon around the Earth. And it turns out that that actually takes 256 cycles to get back to the beginning. So now you need something that somehow makes 256. And you get that by meshing a lot of gears. If you mesh a 10-tooth gear with a 50-tooth gear, you get a lot of revolutions. And that really is basic mechanics. How many turns do you need to make up a year or make up a cycle that lasts 4 or 10 or 15 years? And that sort of mathematics through observation of the heavens was going on since the Babylonian times. And the Babylonians handed it down to the Greeks. And my father said the Greeks understood Babylonian mathematics in the same way that gurus in California understood Buddhism and yoga. You get the basic idea, but you don't have the hundreds and thousand-year background to it. So each time it got passed down, it got a little more diluted, and then wars wiped out, whole islands full of people and civilizations, and it just got lost. Parts of it were carried on in the Arab world, and thank goodness they were there to preserve the mathematics through what we call the Dark Ages, although a friend of mine who's written books on my dad's Chaucer manuscript has written a book called The Light Ages, which tells the other side of the story. But it doesn't need complicated machinery. It needs a straight line and 2 sticks tied together, and with that you can actually make the gears that are in that machine.
So it's interesting you can make the gears, and my question is, so what data set do you think that the people who, or the person who actually built this device, or people, what data were they using, and how, and where did that come from to come up with the precision that you see?
Well, my father used to talk about the shepherds in Greece and in Babylon, who once it got dark, had absolutely nothing to look at except the sky. Mm-hmm. And if you are smart, as many shepherds were, you didn't have much of a choice if you were going to be born into a family of shepherds. But there were smart ones who made little pictures of what was going on and where the stars went and which things moved amongst the stars. And then coming back to the next year when it was the first full moon after the spring cycle, you could figure things out from year to year. And in a lifetime of looking at the stars and then handing down that knowledge to your kids who were also shepherds, it doesn't take too many life cycles to know exactly how these things are moving. And more to your point, there had to be machines before this one. This could not have been the first try at it. But with melting down metals to make primarily war machinery, we lost a lot of them. And when my dad first proposed that this was a kind of celestial computer, people said it can't be. That thing must have been dropped on the ocean floor, 1,000 years after you say it was. And that led to shows on television that talked about impossible things from ancient times. And people love writing science fiction, and this was a great start for science fiction tales. So separating what was actually true from what was sheer fantasy bugged my dad for many years. And he came to my school in North Haven, and he talked about the Antikythera mechanism. I think I was in 4th grade. And he said that this was like going into Tutankhamun's tomb and finding a grandfather clock. You know, it wasn't what you expected, and it broke all the rules, but darn it, it was there. And that's a belief he stuck to.
So a quick follow-up then on that, and that is, you said there are still no even partial parts of related mechanisms. Have we found any other related mechanisms, even not as complete as this one, but little gears and connections of gears? Have we found archaeologically other possible pieces of similar mechanisms?
Well, astrolabes continued to be made and got better and better, primarily, again, in the Arabic world. And I think particularly in today's political climate, it is all too easy to discount the magnificent job Islam and the Arabic culture played in keeping those skills alive. And at a time when anything you wrote on papyrus or goat hide was likely to be lost, and the libraries at Alexandria were sacked and burned to the ground. So a lot of the history has been lost. And when you look at how hard it is today to find an Apple I computer in working condition, and that's from 1980 or so, let alone something like Galileo's telescope, and now we're going back 1,000 years before that. On one hand, it's not surprising so much got lost, and I think 100 years from now, we'll have a much better chain of things that connect before and after this, because we know for sure that this was somewhere between 100 and 200 BC. And we know that that was school of Archimedes, and we know that they were really smart, and they had machinery, which simply hasn't lasted.
Well, I think we have to leave it there, but thank you so much, Jeff, for this incredible talk.
You're welcome. Come up and look at the thing.